So now we'll begin with the World Watchers, and we'll switch gears off to the next part of the program. This is broadcast number 651, May 28th, 1984. It's Memorial Day, so I decided to put a rest on some subjects such as Edwin Meese and the Cartergate Papers and John DeLorean with Johnny Carson. Remember last August I was detailing the mob connections to Johnny Carson and his bank. We'll put that off for till next week or the week after, okay? And the biotech and the helionetics, and I thought we would just talk about some people that have been murdered and some interesting deaths. I could do that for 50 consecutive weeks. I have the articles on the bodies piled up at home, but I thought maybe, being as it's Memorial Day and you're all in the mood for that, we would talk about that subject. Before I get into that, I do want to bring up and remind you what we were doing a year ago this week, because that was a very, very important broadcast. They all are. I was talking about Golden Boy, the book about William Holden. I believe he was murdered. And that a year ago this week, I was talking about the bank that closed headed by Johnny Carson, and that was the narcotic connections that he was protesting about. This week he didn't know a thing about it, but that's not true. I remember Richard Nixon, the President of the United States, saying he didn't know about Watergate, so I guess Carson can say he doesn't know about John DeLorean. And a year ago this week I was talking about John DeLorean and his Asian heroin connections and the Colombia cocaine connections, and also a new book that came out on the Kennedy assassinations called Contract on America, Mafia Murders by David Scheim, Scheim. He leaves out the name of Roy Cohn and Mo Dalitz and the connections to Paul Laxalt in Las Vegas. Laxalt running the Republican GOP money funds, and the mob connections, the hit teams to the real murder of John and Robert Kennedy. And Roy Cohn, of course, is on the board of Western Goals, piped into the Los Angeles Police Department. We talked about the life and times of Klaus Barbie. He's been over in France for a long time, hasn't gone to trial yet, which is kind of interesting. And then last year was the story that broke in the Los Angeles Times, detective in spying case linked to the Birch leader. And this was the story of Larry McDonald, who would soon be killed in September. This was in May 30th on Kazoo. We were talking about that. And that was the connection of the spying case of the Los Angeles Police Department of files that were ordered to be destroyed in 1975, being fed to the military offices in Alexandria, Virginia, not only to the Birch Society, but to Reinhard Gehlen's BND, the German intelligence, to Vienna, around the world. And there's a major lawsuit going on now of 55 or more people and celebrities against Western Goals whose names were in there. These are law-abiding citizens whose names go into national computers. It may get more attention than the case got during the year because of the prominence of the people involved. Before we get on to the obituaries for Memorial Day, I want to mention the technique of Ronald Reagan that's so clever, and the people working around him. I mentioned last week when the story of Walter Ralph and how he got his passport from the Vatican to go to South America broke into the news, and there was a demand of Catholic groups to explain why the Vatican gave this top Nazi his passport. 5 days later, Walter Ralph was declared dead. This is called the cause and effect, before and after. So, of course, the coffin was closed, and everybody concerned said the case is closed. I don't believe it's proof that he's dead. But when they wanted an explanation, he was conveniently tucked away and the case was closed. When the headlines came out this past week, May 24th, William Casey, the CIA director, got Carter papers and his name was on them. They've been on them for a whole year, and confirmed that he, in fact, has been part of leaking all the material to Ronald Reagan to run his presidency and his campaign. The next day, Ronald Reagan went to dedicate the building at the CIA and praised Casey as being a wonderful, wonderful man. And he dedicated a new addition to the CIA building that has 1.1 million square feet they're adding on. Can you see that size? 1 million square feet, $190 million. They need a little more for the lack of intelligence they have. They have to have this space. They said the computers take a lot of space. When the expose of Henry Kissinger came out, when Seymour Hersh wrote his book about Henry Kissinger, The Price of Power and spent 6 years on it, a Pulitzer Prize reporter. The very week that he did that, Ronald Reagan put Henry Kissinger in charge of Central America. His response to America was to promote Henry Kissinger. His response to the Casey story was to be seen and photographed with Casey smiling and happy and satisfied with Mr. Casey. When Edwin Meese was nominated as the Attorney General, and they had these scandals, and financial scandals, and connections of promotions and jobs, and home payments due, and promotions, high-paying jobs of people without the talent to do the jobs in return for taking care of his homes and his finances. When they got a special prosecutor going, the President of the United States says, we won't go into this until November the 6th, until after the election. So he quickly said, that's it, November the 6th, we'll look into Edwin Meese. And then he said, I will reappoint him. When I am elected, I will reappoint him no matter what you think. When Ronald Reagan wanted $61 million for El Salvador, there was talk that 4 nuns had been killed and hadn't been solved. So they rounded up 4 street people, the most pathetic kinds of souls I ever saw, and one of them said he was threatened to be killed if he didn't confess to the murders. Well, why wouldn't you take that seriously when 40,000 were killed before him? And our Congress, the Democratic Congress, gave Ronald Reagan $61 million because they rounded up these 4 men, and the defense attorney didn't even know them. He had 24 hours on a case that's been going on for several years. The jury was locked up. He said, I don't care if they sleep all night or what they do. The jury can't leave. And the judge was so proud. And then Mr. Duarte can come to Washington. Now, that isn't Ronald Reagan's problem. That's Congress's problem. Instead of saying, wait, you can't have the $61 million until we speak to the defendants. They may not even be alive today, or they switch them. Those poor kids were dragged in off the street. So that no matter what happens, there's a response quickly, positively, and this kind of... car out on the street. This kind of behavior has to be stopped. It's totally insane. Mother Jones has a good issue this week. I don't know if you can get on your newsstands or if you subscribe. There is a column, The Sleaze Thickens, by Deidre English. She describes the Reagan administration could be the biggest assemblage of crooks in the nation's history. 2 more high-ranking officials may be added to the growing list of figures who've fallen under suspicion. There is another article, Corporate Practices, the FBI and the Bechtel Group. You saw some newspaper briefs on that. It's about the Bechtel organization and payoffs of George Shultz, Secretary of State, and Caspar Weinberger, our Secretary of Defense. There's an interview with Yoko Ono by John Weiner, W-I-E-N-E-R. He has a book coming out on the politics of John Lennon and how the FBI were taunting him and how they have concealed papers, and he has sued them. And then there's an article by Jonathan Whitney, who writes for the Wall Street Journal and does exposés on the Nugan Hand and the CIA banks. Oh, what a lovely war, and it's about Grenada. We got there just in time, Reagan announced, to the thrill of Americans. And this is about what happened, and the first casualty of war was truth. And, of course, I've done a lot of research on that. So this is one issue of Mother Jones with a lot of material on it. Now, as I say, in keeping with Memorial Day, we'll just talk about people who have been killed or caused murders and in theme with the Memorial Day. The San Francisco Chronicle had a story from the New York Times. Bombing failed in Vietnam War, the CIA reported. The CIA concluded that the bombings in 1966 and 67 didn't do anything but help the North Vietnamese, and it brought in more aid, and that our dropping these bombs on native populations' heads didn't really help us at all. General Westmoreland has come to the conclusion. Now, it certainly, it says the bombing failed in Vietnam. The bombing didn't fail when it falls on all those heads. When you think of how many people died, the bombing worked. It just failed to a certain extent, but they shuffle paper around and give you a definition that maybe we should, now they'll go in, we need more missiles or atomic bombs because regular bombing doesn't work. So now they admit that the failure there, all those deaths and fatalities and people terrorized by bombs dropping Cambodia and Vietnam, thanks to Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer and Alexander Haig and the whole war effort, General Westmoreland and that gang. and the cast of characters who love these wars every 10 years have the nerve to come out and say that the bombings were a failure. What are all the memorial days and the coffins for, and the names on the memorial in Washington and all the bodies that are mutilated? What was that about? Now, talking about large body counts, we'll get into, I want to bring up the question of the new president of Germany. I don't know how many of you saw it. I've talked to several people this week, and it's in the New York Times, but not on the evening news. This is the New York Times. Richard von Weizsäcker, WEIZSACKER, is the new president in Bonn, Germany. Weizsäcker was a person in Adolf Hitler's military. He's 64 years old. His father was working for von Ribbentrop. His father was a war criminal at Nuremberg, and he went to law school and defended his father. He's now the 6th president of the Federal Republic of Germany. He was a member of the SS. His father was in the SS. And interestingly enough, he traveled around with his father in Nazi Germany. And his father, Ernest, not only worked for von Ribbentrop, but he was in 1943, he went from von Ribbentrop's department, chief state secretary in the Foreign Office, to ambassador to the Vatican for Nazi Germany. Now, 1943 was the year that the Nazis went underground, changed their names or changed their ideology. So Daddy went to the Vatican, and his son went with him, of course, and that's when Walter Rauff and Mr. Montini, the Secretary of the Vatican, were getting ready to write passports for 30 or 40,000 Nazis, and working with our intelligence and Alan Dulles over there in Switzerland, working close to the Vatican. So the new 6th president of Germany comes from that background. San Francisco Chronicle has a story that Mr. Weizsäcker was president of the German Protestant Congress from 1964 to 1970, served in the German army during World War II, went back to law school, worked for the Waldhausen banking firm in Essen, an executive of a pharmaceutical work, the Boehringer Pharmaceutical. I don't know if that's linked to IG Farben or not. And one story describes his father as a career diplomat, secretary in the German Foreign Office. In the book Who's Who in Nazi Germany, Daddy Ernest Führer von Weizsäcker is described the Foreign Office diplomat who served the Third Reich as state secretary and ambassador to the Holy See, and he helped overthrow Denmark. He was in with the spearheading of overthrowing various countries with the Fifth Column. It describes his father's work in Berlin in 1943, and he was arrested and put on trial as a war criminal by the Allies. And of course, John J. McCloy released the war criminals out of the Nuremberg trials where they could get back to work. His daddy was released in 1950 and conveniently died in 1951. I guess they didn't want the smear of the father, who was a high-ranking SS. The SS are the choice people sworn to life to protect the 1,000-year Reich. He got out in 1950, but his son is now the 6th president of Germany. In the Brown book, it describes, again, Mr. Weizsäcker, his father, and it said how he worked in the organization of the aggression against Denmark, and how the fascists worked in the Secretary of State. Secretary von Weizsäcker had high secret meetings and helped plan the overthrow of neutral Denmark. And then it goes on to say how von Ribbentrop, the boss of his father, was hung as one of the high criminals of the war, but he himself got off. Weizsäcker got off. Only a handful of the top ones were hung, and he got off. In the Brown book, it describes the fascist Foreign Office and the imperialist Office of Conquest, and it describes Undersecretary Weizsäcker and his other Nazi friends and the Reich offices and the Wehrmacht. This is one of Hitler's top Nazis, whose son now is the president of Germany, whose father was sworn in the SS, the elite group, and so forth. Now, the president is going to Normandy, again, to the war stories. This is Memorial Day, right? He's going over there to Europe and to Normandy to see the beachhead. It's 40 years since the invasion of Normandy. The New York Times has an article I call the chutzpah of the year. The German government wanted to be invited to the celebrations, But Chancellor Helmut Kohl is ready to resign. He's through now, and the new Nazi president will take over. Mr. WEIZSACKER wanted to come to the party, and the French said, no, he better not come. As a matter of fact, until Mitterrand was president, Giscard d'Estaing wouldn't celebrate the defeat of Germany. He's so pro-German that it was not allowed to celebrate the end of the war. But there's going to be this anniversary celebration, and the Germans wanted to send a representative to the celebration of the invasion of Normandy. Now, in keeping with Memorial Day, I have a newsletter from the Bulge Bugle. I didn't know there was such an organization. I should have known. But Jim Cooley, who's writing a book about a person who was in the Battle of the Bulge and taken prisoner, has been a friend of mine. He's an author. The book will be coming out soon, and I'll let you know about it. He takes the Bulge Bugle, and he sent me a page of it from Volume 8, Number 1, March 1984. And there was a reunion of guys from the Bulge, and evidently this comes out, and of course I'm going to send for it. And it tells about the Germans building up for the Battle of the Bulge. And see, this was the turning point of the war, because the Nazis had planned from 1943 to 45 that if they were going to lose, they'd put all of the top officers of the SS and the Wehrmacht into a geographic section like a pocket. Then General Patton and the Americans would surround this area and round them up, and among them was Henry Kissinger, a young private in the Army, and they'd put them all in a special place and then release them, let them write the history of the war, and incorporate them into the American intelligence and put them on salary to America. And that way they wouldn't be scattered or grabbed up by the Russians. So there's a description in this Bulge Bugle of part of their meetings and some questions about the Bulge they're still asking. Then there's a picture of the Secretary of the Army here at the party, Honorable John Marsh, Jr., Secretary of the Army, and he's shaking hands with somebody, but there's no article about him, and the man is Fritz Kramer of the 84th Infantry. Now, that's my old friend Fritz Kramer, Henry Kissinger's mentor. And in the bulletin on the Battle of the Bulge, it tells about one horrible night when Clyde Bowden of Arlington in Virginia of the 84th Division remembered playing poker 3 nights in a row before the battle and then watching his poker buddies killed. A few hours later, 3 of them were killed. Well, I'm going to call some of these men back east this week. I just got this bulletin, and ask Clyde Bowden if he remembers what Fritz Kramer from the 84th, because Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer were staying in a hayloft somewhere, and the others went out to die. Here's a picture. That's Fritz Kramer. In the Bulge Bugle, this is the first public picture that I know about. I'm sure there must be more, but I've been harping on this character for 2 years and handing out bulletins, and it doesn't describe what he did in the Bulge or whether he knows his people, but it has him with the 84th, which is where Hitler's Fritz Kramer was, in the identical spot. So at least there is a newsletter, and we'll get on to that. Now, updating the John Kennedy assassination in memory of Memorial Day, an article this week, Gerald Ford will attend the GOP convention in Dallas and Nixon won't. I believe Nixon won't because he remembers he was in Dallas when Kennedy was killed, and we talked about it a few weeks ago. I don't think he would dare the karma of Dallas go back at this time with these particular people. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the name J. David Truby, Truby. He wrote me a letter about a month ago asking me for a tape cassette of Mitchell Ward Bell at Larry Flint's home, and I recognized the name right away because Truby wrote the books on silencers that I've mentioned many times on the air, and I've asked the researchers into the John Kennedy assassination and on the air and written letters, how come nobody has ever addressed themselves to the question of silencers that killed John Kennedy when the House Select Committee and was listening for bullets, how many bullets can we hear? I have talked about this over and over on the air with you and shared my feelings about why the so-called experts don't admit that they're silencers when Mr. Truby was writing books with pictures of Mitchell Ward Bell and he knows Gordon Nobel and all these people. And I never wrote to him. So he wrote me a letter, and I thought this is a good chance to ask him. He's the expert on silencers. So I wrote to him and asked him about it. Could silencers been used like over the Daltex building or at the grassy knoll that killed John Kennedy, and they're listening for these firecracker shots that would come from the roof or the third floor of the depository that are the obvious sounds, and silencers could be used. And he wrote back to me, and he said, I'm glad you like my silencer book. I now have 4 of them out. Was a silencer used on the JFK hit? It's possible. I don't know. It surely would fit the needs of the mission. Then he says, funny thing, I was in Chicago to interview Sam Giancana. Remember, Giancana and John Rosselli have been named in conjunction with the Kennedy assassination, and Giancana was about to testify before the House Select Committee when he was killed June 20th, 1975. He said, funny thing, this is really funny. I was in Chicago to interview Sam Giancana, with his permission, of course, for an article on the Kennedy assassination. And I was supposed to see him. His appointment was for the day after Giancana had been murdered. He had a date to see him on June 21st to talk about the Kennedy murder, and Giancana was murdered on June the 20th. He said he was hit with a silenced .22 pistol. I have seen the weapon. It is very much the same used by our CIA folks. The mob uses it too. And then he said to me, we should do an interview together on this sometime. Maybe if he makes an interview with me, I'll be dead the day before. I don't really want to interview him, but maybe talk to him on the phone. Then he said, General Fritz Kramer, I heard the name when I was on active duty in 1960-61, but he didn't remember details about him. Then he said, I have an article soon in Gung Ho, which you'll have to look for, on the missing Bob Murrow. Remember, Bob Murrow wrote a story on the John Kennedy assassination. He said the book was called I Bought the Guns That Killed JFK, or he referred to that. He said, I did a couple of national articles on him, and he seemed legitimate. Now he's gone away, and he's missing. So that's the second person who's had a sort of a demise or disappearance. One definitely killed, and one's missing. And he wrote to me and wanted me to write back, J. David Truby. He's active with Soldier of Fortune and the books on silencers and weapons for our special elite Army people. So he knows a lot about where the bodies are buried, and I was glad to hear from him. As I said, I want to meet him. Jesse Jackson is the first presidential candidate to mention a political assassination in America. It's been 20 years since Kennedy was killed. And I always said if any candidate ever mentioned the fact that there was a conspiracy in this country, I'd vote for him right away. Jesse Jackson had interviews the last couple of weeks. These are the stories like in the Chronicle. Jackson links the government to Martin Luther King's death. He says, nobody would ever convince me it was a one-person operation. I believe the government had a role in Dr. King's assassination. The FBI said their role was to stop the black movement, to stop the Black Messiah. I don't know what there was, but the climate was set for discrediting King. And he said, I saw James Earl Ray. I met with him in prison. It's clear he was involved. It's clear he wasn't capable of pulling that off. I remain convinced that he couldn't have done it. And he says he believed there was a conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King. Can you believe that somebody running for presidential office in the United States can actually say that a conspiracy to murder somebody in this country existed when there are literally thousands of deaths? As John Stockwell said, the CIA has killed about 1 million people. But here's a candidate who says, I believe they did it, and there was a conspiracy, and there's no way that James Earl Ray did it alone. Well, right after he had that interview, he had 4 days later an airplane problem where he was flying from Florida to Dallas, and he was so scared that he got on the ground and kissed the ground in Dallas, Texas. Washington Post has a story. FAA experts checking Jesse Jackson's plane for structural damage. And it was a special plane. The Secret Service is investigating a 4-engine turboprop Lockheed that was chartered from Galaxy Airline in Fort Lauderdale. It's the only one plane owned by the company. It's a company that has only one plane. Can you imagine what kind of a company that is? And it's used for charter flights from Florida to Las Vegas to Atlantic City. I mean, this is a one-company mafia plane that they're putting Jesse Jackson on when he's talking about killing Martin Luther King, and the mob had a good role in that. Luggage flew around. They blamed it supposedly on the weather. They were singing taps, thought they were going to die. Harding Carter III said it was the worst plane he had ever been on, and they checked it for structural damage to see what happened to the plane, in addition to whether they thought there was something dangerous about it. And this one of the 4 engines was shut down on a flight recently from Baton Rouge to Columbus, Ohio, and that's the plane they gave Jesse Jackson. And right after that, within a couple of days, Jesse Jackson's best friend, the most prominent black person practically in America outside of show people like Richard Pryor and Michael Jackson, a developer in Washington, D.C., a well-known man in Washington, D.C., close to the black political scene, as I say, a close friend of Jesse Jackson's. He was killed in a plane crash. Theodore HAGANS II, H-A-G-A-N-S. Now, this was in the Washington Times and Washington Post. I didn't see it on NBC or CBS. Do you see the nightly news about this particular gentleman? Extremely wealthy developer in Washington, D.C. He had caused a lot of trouble for the powers that be. In 1964, he had challenged the Corinthian Yacht Club because they barred him from membership because he was black. The club lost their lease on federally owned dock because of the lawsuit. In 1971, he became a leader and challenged the civil rights organizations and became the first black to serve on the board of directors of the Potomac Electric Power Company. I guess there's no more blacks there anymore now. He and his son were killed, and they said the exact cause of the plane crash is unknown. It is an apparent failure of one of the plane's engines. You know, we have apparent heart attacks. There's apparent failure of the engine. It's at a time when he's working hard to get Jesse Jackson elected. He has a beach house on Marco Island, an exclusive resort in Florida, evidently an extremely wealthy man, and he also owned a good hunk of the franchise of the multi-million-dollar parking concession at the Dulles International Airport. That's usually remaining job for the mafia. I understand that they have a big control of the airport, the franchises there, and the parking. But he had a big hunk of that, and he's gone, and his son is gone, the man who could follow him. A loss of the black community, of an organizer, of a political activist who was working in the system and making it, who has an apparent failure of one of the engines and is killed. And one of the problems, granted, planes don't always hold up, but there's a conspiracy of silence around these people that is eerie, too, because you're not getting very much about that. Now, People magazine had a rule for quite a few years. It was described in the San Jose Mercury. Don't put pictures of dead people or black on the cover. And now they've changed their attitude, and it's an article about People magazine called Cover Former Lives by Joan Kaufman. And it says you almost have to be dead to be on the cover. Dead is better than alive. And it tells about how many covers they sold when Jessica Savage died, Dennis Wilson, Karen Carpenter, Grace Kelly, John Lennon. Goes into Natalie Wood, and it says dead people are the right stuff. And this person wrote, when I started 2 years ago, it was unusual to have someone dead on the cover. And now there's a joke. There was a joke then that you couldn't be on the cover if you were dead or black. But after Kennedy was assassinated, they didn't have Kennedy. They had Lyndon Johnson. But they changed all that. Elvis Presley in 1977, when they had the cover, it made so much money, and John Lennon made so much money. And this article is about these dead people that are bringing in the bucks. The Lennon murder brought in over 3 million copies were sold. Can you imagine? And Newsweek, and it's really very popular when the celebrities die. Well, one of the things that is attractive to people, I think, is that their sense that something is wrong. These Jessica Savages, or the car of Grace Kelly going over the hill, or the way Elvis Presley dies with nobody attending, dead on the floor in the bathroom, and John Lennon just ready to come out with a new album to emerge after being secluded so many years. There's an aura or a mystery. There's a similarity between if they're shot, the grin on the alleged assassin, or the car in the ditch, the unsolved cases, nobody looking them up. People are buying it and wondering. They know about John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and now it's going to be a thing where the hype is to cover the dead people and make a lot of money, but they're also the attraction, I think, in the minds of people, like, what in the heck is going on? If I read this, will I know more about it? So dead is in, And of course, since 1972, I said, and I haven't done it yet, I wanted to write a book called Murderville, USA, because I knew Dead was in 12 years ago, and it's getting really big. And as long as they're going to do these things, they're going to make bucks at the same time. It's just a half after the hour. We'll take a 1-minute break and then go on to part 2 of this broadcast. Your ordinary paper. We'll now start with part 2, broadcast 651. It's May the 28th, 1984. There is a story in the San Jose Mercury and the Washington Post, a small one on the Korean airline KL007. This is the way it reads. The judge limits the court's power. Remember, I was glad that people were to sue the government on the Korean airline story so they could get some more information about the air flights. Well, a federal judge, Judge Aubrey E. Robinson, Jr., acting in a suit arising from the Soviet downing of a South Korean airline, ruled yesterday, now listen to this, that the courts have no authority to act on political questions about decisions made by the United States Armed Forces. Now, listen to that again. That means that the military, like Nazi Germany, the courts that were perverted, that I mentioned many times over and over, the government, the legal civilian government, can't act if the U.S. Army is involved. The U.S. is protected. Now, remember the story of Leslie Howard, the actor, who was on an airplane and they knew the Nazis were going to destroy the plane, but they didn't save the plane or the passengers because then the Germans would know that we were piped into their intelligence system, and for the greater good, they sacrificed 100 or more people so that they could protect more people and listen to the conversations of the Germans. If they had picked up the other, then the Germans would have used a different means of communication. Now, that has an excuse that was passable then, and I didn't study the case then, so I don't know enough about it. But in this particular case, the interesting thing about this case is that you have a congressman, a right-wing congressman, where there's committees against the Korean Committee, against the Soviet Union, where the media had their scripts written, their stories written. It was like going to World War III. It was a cause célèbre. The martyr of the Birch Society, shot down by the communists when he tells you communism is so bad. It is a political act that can get you into war, like the Reichstag fire was excuse for rounding up well-meaning people who weren't communists and putting them in the camps and getting them killed and out of the way. So when you know that a plane is going off course for some reason, and they knew it was going off course, they didn't warn them because they're not obligated to warn them, but they can use the benefit of martyring the man for the political purposes, for getting more missiles, for deploying missiles along the coast in Europe, for putting weapons up in the Arctic, in the Pacific. It is an excuse to have another $45 billion budget or $2 billion submarine in the Pacific because of the Korean airline. So the excuse of not letting the people know on the plane that they are going over the Soviet Union is so limp in this case because the act became political. I'll read this one more time. The judge said regarding the suit, he threw it out, the courts, his court, who knows who Judge Robinson is, the courts have no authority to act on political questions on decisions that are made by the U.S. Armed Forces. The armed forces precede the courts. He made his decision to dismiss a lot of lawsuits against the federal government coming out of the Korean airline flight September the 1st over the Sea of Japan. He said the relatives of the victims may look at government files and uncover, if they want, the existence of whether there was a legal duty to warn or advise civilian aircraft if they were in a position that was dangerous. They can look that up. But there were 81 lawsuits filed by families of 240 passengers, and these have been thrown out because the civilian courts can't come in and question the United States Armed Forces decision, but the Armed Forces can tell you we need hundreds of millions of dollars, whereas they might have prevented the flight by telling him to come back and slowed down the arms weapon escalation that they don't have the money to pay for anyway. Now, regarding the Grenada trials, remember those took place, the killing of Maurice Bishop, and 7 people were rounded up for a trial down there in Grenada. This happened last October. It's about 8 months since then. San Francisco Examiner, hearing put off in Grenada killings. The judge has postponed again a preliminary hearing until June on the slaying of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop and 7 supporters of his last October that led to the invasion of the Caribbean island. The judge has set a new date because 14 of the 20 defendants don't have a lawyer yet. This is from October until it's almost June. There's no lawyer for 14 people, and the defendants are saying that America is there illegally, that they resulted, the U.S. invasion led to an illegal operation, and that the government can't try them because it's an illegitimate government. The United States had no business coming in, and they said this should be taken to the international courts, and the people that killed Maurice Bishop and the other person say, you have no right even, we don't have a lawyer, but you have no right to be here. So scram. So I think they don't want the trial because the people that killed Maurice Bishop funded Bernard Cord. This was the CIA and Robert Vesco and his CIA contacts. Even though he's living in Cuba, the CIA was involved heavily down there in those deaths. So they have a contradiction. They can't convict the people they hired to kill Maurice Bishop and his 7 friends. So they don't want to go to trial. They won't accept the American courts. It's a catch-22. We hired them and paid them, and they were working in collusion with the medical school there. After Maurice Bishop was killed, they were in contact with the American officials, Robert Pastor, Dr. Peter Byrne. So they say, look, get an international court because we use them to allow us to go down there to start tourism and to clean out the people that were there and to use the airstrip. Today there's an article where have a new American company to put in the airstrip down there that we wanted all along, that was started by Maurice Bishop. And the defendants have no attorney, and of course we're afraid to go to trial, so they're stalling out. There was another death I thought I should bring up. I haven't gone into some of these miscellaneous deaths, but I think they're interesting. Top space mission engineer and 2 others die in a plane crash. The chief engineer from McDonnell Corporation, who was in charge of the Mercury and Gemini space missions, went into a 24-inch oak tree and had a little plane accident outside of Ukiah, California. He crashed into an oak tree, one of the main scientists for the space program. In the early 1960s, Mr. Walter F. Burke was in charge of McDonnell Corporation, responsible for building the Mercury and Gemini spacecraft. McDonnell Douglas Corporation spokesman said Burke, who retired in 1973, was the father of the company's space program, and he ends his life with a 24-inch oak tree. What if it was a 30-inch oak tree? But such details. He didn't fly well. He could send us up to the space program and design all that, but he goes into a 24-inch oak tree. Another fatal crash that many of you read about, this was in a lot of papers, but the implications weren't discussed. That was Lieutenant General Robert Bond. Like James Bond, outside of Las Vegas, he was flying from Nellis Air Force Base in a secret area, top secret area number 51. Over 10 years ago, that's where the U-2 flights were tested and worked out, the ones that went over the Soviet Union and conveniently downed to break up the peace conference of Khrushchev and Eisenhower at the time. He was using a top experimental plane that first they said was the stealth plane, and then it turned out that the fatal crash was the Soviet MiG, the MiG, Soviet MiG Flogger supersonic fighter. Now, what's important about this, the plane comes from the Mideast and Israel, and we send over Soviet weapons and test them here. The problem is that we're always told that war or dropping of bombs or provocations will come from kamikaze. But how many Soviet-marked planes could circle an American plane, say like the Larry McDonald, or out at sea, or circle a ship, and our American ships have said if the Soviet circles will shoot them. How many Soviet planes, just like Soviet guns, are bought by Samuel Cummings and the gun merchants of the world and then distributed? And if somebody is killed, they say the KGB was here. How many Soviet planes can be used as a provocation that have the markings and gear? See, the change of costume, the change of equipment was what Otto Skorzeny did so brilliantly for Adolf Hitler and then for our CIA. He got people in Germany in 1943 when the Nazis were going under, rounded them up and had them learn to smoke cigarettes like Americans, talk English, use American habits. He got American Army uniforms that he was never prosecuted for, American tanks that were never explained, went into the Battle of Bulge as if they were Americans, and the Americans were fooled, and then they took off their clothes and they were part of Hitler's elite guard, the Waffen-SS, and so forth. Skorzeny was released from prison along with these other criminals and then went to Madrid to work for the Central Intelligence Agency and set up the Odessa around the world. But the change of costumes or the change of equipment was very important. But in this case, this can be used again, like the Korean airline, to get you closer to World War III, that you positively see a Soviet plane. Now, if we're flying so many of those Soviet planes, how would you know whether it was a Soviet or whether it was an American in a Soviet suit that's down and we could say they bombed one of our ships? Therefore, give us 60 billion more weapons, more satellites. See, put your atomic warheads in Europe. Look what the Soviets do. Mr. James Bond, flying the plane, was caught. He died, and how he crashed. How many others are there like him? He was one of our best pilots, one of the most experienced, and Lieutenant General Robert Bond, and he was a victim caught in the Soviet plane. The Daily World has a story about a Chicago labor leader who was killed. There was an inquiry into his death. The Commission for Justice for Rudy Lozano, Lozano, he helped people who had escaped from El Salvador. He lived in Cook County. He was getting death threats. He helped labor union and organizers in the International Garment Workers Union. He helped people who had the lowest wages in the entire United States with their living conditions, and when they were defrauded, he was helping them. And he, as I say, in Cook County, he was getting deaths. They rounded up an 18-year-old kid and had a trial, and they said he's the one who killed Lozano, and then they had a mistrial and want to have a dismissal of the entire murder charge. They charged a guy named Gregory Escobar, accused of killing him, literally a teenager such as those in El Salvador. And the way you close a case, you can have the finest techniques with laboratories, with fingerprints, scientific techniques. You see all this stuff on the news, the TV, how the Crime Bureau has budget for these wonderful ways to solve crimes. But this is the way they solve a crime. You turn a pocket inside out and you call it a robbery, and you drop white powder and you call it a drug death. And you don't need any more equipment. If it's a political person, if it's a labor organizer, if it's a artist or writer or somebody, you simply, as I say, pull the pocket or leave the drug, and case is closed. Apparent, and particularly if they had a history of drugs. And this went off quickly with Lenny Bruce, who was very political, who was complaining about the system, the murder of John Kennedy, and so forth, who said a few dirty words that are common knowledge, and I can even put them on the air. And he may have had a drug habit, he did. But you give him a nice little overdose, and you say, well, Bruce had a drug problem. You get rid of him, and then you don't have that kind of a nightclub act anymore. Well, there is a call for opening up this case, and I say this didn't make the headlines. You didn't see much about that. Another story you might or might not have seen, Western public relations chief for 20th Century Fox, beaten to death. He was bludgeoned to death. A longtime organizer for distributing movies, Lee Allen Beaupre, Beaupre, 42 years old, found in Los Angeles. He's been working 6 months for 20th Century Fox. He was a reporter for the Variety, for Daily Variety in Hollywood. He distributed Easy Rider, 5 Easy Pieces, The Exorcist, The Apocalypse Now, The Trial of Billy Jack. Lived in Westwood just 6 months with 20th Century Fox. Now, Chris Kraft owns 20% of 20th Century Fox, and John DeLorean was on the board of Chris Kraft. There are a lot of investigations of 20th Century Fox with the Continental Bank in Illinois. Now they've been going on. 20th Century Fox is a dangerous group to work for. They all seem to be, but there are a lot of deaths around that studio that I do want to do. I've accumulated them since the time that John DeLorean was arrested, and they changed hands over there and new managers came in. There had been a whole series of deaths at 20th Century Fox. There's no motive, no reason. He was bludgeoned to death, and because 20th Century is in the news with the DeLorean relationship and Henry Kissinger on the board of 20th Century, and Mark Rich is in the news all the time, paying those huge fees for his taxes that he won't pay in the United States, and he bought 50% of 20th Century Fox when Marvin Davis first went in. People around 20th Century Fox are controversial, so I thought I'd mention that. I also forgot to mention this last month, or didn't get into it, former Representative Walter Flowers, a Democrat from Alabama. Richard Nixon mentioned him when Nixon was surfaced with his $55,000 to do his TV shows. I think the name of Flowers came up. Flowers in the House Judiciary voted 2 articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon. And the very week that Richard Nixon is being resurrected in the news media and becoming the darling of the media, Mr. Flowers dropped dead of that very contagious disease called an apparent heart attack. An apparent a part of a plane falls off, and a apparent heart attack. Well, he had an apparent heart attack, political enemy from the House Judiciary against Nixon. As Nixon's star rises, people around him, and certainly lots of Watergate-related deaths that I wrote about and talk about, coincidence or not, the same week that Nixon is surfacing and the darling of the media, he dropped dead, 51 years old. Congressman hurt fleeing house fire. This one didn't die, but he broke his back. Representative James Sessenbrenner from Wisconsin has a broken back. He was on the second floor of his house, and the house burned down, about $150,000 worth of damage. 3-term congressman from Milwaukee. He's on the House Judiciary Subcommittee, like Flower was on the House Judiciary. At the House at the time were 2 students from Australia. I wonder if there were Nugan-Han connections. The wife and children were conveniently away. They were flying to Milwaukee, where they spend the summer. He's alone with 2 people from Australia. 2 of them run away. He's asleep when the fire's going. Then the house guests, they're very nice house guests, they run out. And he's left, Mr. Sessenbrenner, and jumped out the window and broke his back, and I haven't heard much about it. Since then, this was just this last week. I looked up in Who's Who and in the congressional bio about Sessenbrenner because when I talk about Senator Joe McCarthy and the people behind him from Wisconsin, there was a Frank Sessenbrenner, the same spelling, and Walter Harnischfeger that I've talked about, the 2 Nazi connections to Senator Joe McCarthy. And I have no way of knowing that the same city and the same name and spelling in the congressional directory didn't give that much background. This particular Sessenbrenner went to Stanford University, and it gives his political life and who he married, but very little in the congressional directory. So it'd be interesting to know if he's related to the same Sessenbrenner that put Senator Joe McCarthy in, and what was going on at the House with the people from Australia. The Nugan-Han story is far from over. It's just boiling to the edge, along with that bank in Hawaii, the CIA bank, and the various murders. And I mentioned last week or the week before, the fellow arrested in San Francisco linked to the Nugan-Han bank, and William Colby, who said he would be killed if he was sent back, that so many people were killed. Well, that is like St. Helena, the volcano. This thing is boiling over. So if I see that there's house guests from Australia and they leave the house and he's left to jump and the house is burning, I have to ask why, or at least call your attention to it. Now, down in Florida, there were articles and law opinions on David Kennedy's death, and we've talked about those. One in the Los Angeles Herald, judge okays the police refusal to supply the Kennedy data, a criminal investigation underway, and there was a big argument about releasing the autopsy report of David Kennedy, and finally there was a very strict court order saying you've got to release it. And then when they released it, they described groin injections in the Kennedy autopsy. And the gentleman down in Dade County who released this, Dr. Charles Weldy, said that's pretty unusual. The most people don't go to the kind of trouble, except people that are military or public figures or high profile. The military inject themselves in the groin with cocaine, or public figures. I thought public figures sniffed it, but I can't imagine the kicks you get in the groin out of this. But one thing I thought of when I read it, and I talked with people who said, well, it's not uncommon. It may be uncomfortable, but not uncommon. Why did they hold this back for 2 to 3 weeks, the autopsy report, if it's so common? And I remember Dick Gregory saying that when he was down in Atlanta checking on the children who had been murdered, that many of them had needle marks in the groin. Now, those little kiddies weren't taking cocaine in the groin, and he thought it was to experiment on interferon or some other kind of thing that they were doing. He thought it was extracting interferon with them for cancer research, and he thought it was unusual that the autopsy showed needle marks in the groin. So if it's common, if you say to me it's common for people of the newspaper says the military or in social life to take it, then why would these little children or teenagers down in Atlanta that were murdered have these needle marks? And so the question of David Kennedy, they also said on the autopsy report that they didn't find any no needle marks were visible in his arms, or any incision revealed scar tissue, so that he wasn't forced to go to the groin, and he could sniff it through his nose, and he'd been in a rehab place for a month up in Minneapolis, and they didn't find any other area but in the groin. Now, the New York Daily News has a story about David Kennedy, and a woman whose picture was found at the hotel room. Otherwise, it wouldn't have made the news in this particular paper, and it's been kept out of most of them. And it says one piece of the puzzle still missing is prior to his death, the people he was with. A blonde German-born model in her late 30s was reported to have told the police and friends she was having dinner with David Kennedy in Palm Beach that evening. Kennedy wasn't interested in making any passes at her. She was more like a sister, she said, and so she went back to his place and accompanied to his room. His sister, okay, no newcomer at the social amenities and so forth, but just on a platonic relationship, she went to the room. And the article says that's where the dark side of Kennedy's life took over, when he produced this cocaine. And police said that they found this woman because left in the room was a small portfolio with her photograph and her name that happened to be in Kennedy's room. And they got in touch with her, and she was frightened to death. And she said, I'm going back to Germany. Keep in mind, she wasn't interviewed by anybody. It's sort of like with Miss Smith and with John Belushi, only she's known to the people in town. This German woman said, I'm leaving. I'm afraid of my life. I'm going back to Germany. But I was with him that night. Maybe she put the needle in his groin. They happened to get her, but her name isn't in the major news or wire services. But who is the woman from Germany who had dinner with him, who went back to the room, who left afterwards, who just by a fluke left the name? The New York Daily News carried the story, and they said that there was still mystery to this. So if there were no other injections on him and they held back the report, what were they holding back? Now, along with our Memorial Weekend, which is winding up, we can still talk about some more deaths. Mr. Michael Sindona is sitting in a bank in jail in New York. He's ready, serving his time for the breaking up of the Franklin National Bank. Sindona wants to go back to Italy. He wants to be tried for ordering the killing of George Ambrosoli, Ambrosoli, who was liquidating Sindona's bank. And he wants to go back there to be tried. Well, what he wants to do is to leave Italy like Licio Gelli and go down to Argentina. So he's asking for them to extradite him so he won't have to sit in this cruddy American jail for X amount of years. So he says, send me back to the murder trial. I'll go back. And I'm sure that trial would be a farce. So he's trying to be extradited. He asked at his trial to have the CIA speak, that he worked with the CIA, and I'm sure the CIA would love to get him out of the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, where he masterminded the end of the Franklin National Bank, and get him back there and let him be charged. Remember, Mr. Arrico, the hitman that he was supposed to have hired, was killed out of the same jail in New York City, trying to escape out of the 9th floor just a little while ago. So as long as the witness is dead, Sindona says, oh, send me back now, and let's talk about that murder. And then once he's out of this country, he's home free. He can break the banks, and he also can be home free. And incidentally, speaking of Michael Sindona, there is a newsletter out. Somebody sent me a copy, and some of you may not be aware of it. Certainly I wasn't. It's called Church and State, and it's more interesting and factual than, say, the atheist group. Okay, let me give you the address. It's a magazine, Church and State, published every month. It comes out by the Americans United for Separation of Church and State. It's $10 a year, $1 for a single copy. It comes out of Silver Springs, Maryland. You can write 8120 Fenton Street, Silver Springs, Maryland, 20910. Send a self-addressed label stamp if you want some information. It's $10 a year. And they have a picture of Ronald Reagan touching the finger of John Paul II, like E.T., called the Vatican Connection. And it has a roundup in the Capitol, Reagan's work with church and state, going into the parochial schools, the tax credits, and state legislature, and a large article in this particular issue that was sent to me on this February 1984 on the Vatican Connection with Ronald Reagan, and a detailed work on his close link to the Vatican and campus crusades of missionaries in the schools, and an article, God and Man at the CIA, recruiting religion and combining the religion and the Bible with the Central Intelligence Agency. And then it says, no church has been used and abused more than the Roman Catholic Church, how the CIA has used them. And the whole issue is on the various organizations should be separated from government. It's a very interesting magazine. I appreciate the person who sent it to me, and I am going to subscribe to it. It doesn't mean you don't have to believe in God. You don't throw God out. What it means is that you keep that out of the government and don't use the funds of the Vatican like Michael Sindona or Licio Gelli to buy your president. You don't have $1 million to put up for this election. The way they have, you may send 10 or 20 or 1,000, but the Vatican gives them millions. And so you have a right to understand the process, get everything you can in the way of literature to see what the new bills are, what the legislation is, who the congressmen are, like Senator Lugar, who's the chief fundraiser for the GOP, being close to the Vatican and Nazis in Europe and getting funds from them. Why do you think our congressmen and our presidents act like Nazis in these various countries? Because they're paid by Nazis to do what they're doing. And if you want to separate people like Senator D'Amato from New York, or Senator Lugar from Indiana, and their close ties to Vatican, or the various Mormon ties that are close to the intelligence community, keep the church out of the electoral process if you can. It's never been more prominent than it is now. And speaking of churches, on CBS this week, just last Sunday morning, I was so impressed with a program put out by a group in San Jose, a private school called the Bellarmine Community School, run by Jesuits, a Catholic school. And they had a 3-day seminar, and they worked on it for months, and then they closed the school for 3 weeks and discussed nothing but peace, the search for peace. And they had 2 members of Congress, Don Edwards and Congressman Shao, one a Republican and one a Democrat, talking about bombs and peace, and they read the pastoral letter of the Vatican. What did it mean to them? How do you interpret it? How do you live in a world that is spending $800 million a day on nuclear arms? $800 million a day. That's a good place to wind up the Memorial Day broadcast. $800 million a day. And they had the most brilliant young students, and they're sending them out in the world, and they talked about the morality of this. And they said, if you want to fight communism, there is no precedent in what Jesus did that he would meet anybody, even if he thought they were an enemy, in that way. If you don't meet them in peace, don't meet them at all. Don't meet them in fear. Meet them head on. And a lot of people think because I talk about the Vatican and the CIA that I'm anti-religious or talk about the Zionists and the Nazis. I'm not. You can keep your religion and get your spies out of religion. But if you're celebrating Memorial Day, and that's what this day is set aside for, how can you have a Memorial Day to those who died and allow your government to spend $800 million a day on weapons? You better do some soul searching. That's what these young people did, and maybe next year on Memorial Day we'll put brakes on this and do something about it if we can. This is Mae Brussell. My time is up now. I'll be back with you next week. It's KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.